Something very strange happened in Los Angeles during the 1960s that would change rock and roll and American culture forever, and almost nobody noticed it. A group of individuals with practically no real musical background suddenly became some of the most influential artists of the century. Almost all of them lived in the same small neighborhood. Almost all of them had parents in military or intelligence circles. And sitting right above their homes was a top secret military film studio that the public was never supposed to know about. This is the part of American history that people are told not to look at, but one man did. His name was David McGawan. When McGawan started connecting the facts, the story of the 1960s counterculture stopped looking like a spontaneous movement, and it started looking like something carefully guided from behind the curtain. Today, we follow the life and final years of David McGawan as we explore the mystery of Laurel Canyon and the unsettling pattern he believed was hiding inside one of the most celebrated cultural movements in American history. By the end of this story, you'll understand why he believed the 60s may not have unfolded the way we were told, and why asking that question changed the course of his life. David McGawan entered the world on March 19, 1960, in Torrance, California. At the time, Torrance was a quiet suburban pocket of Los Angeles. Sidewalks, backyard sprinklers, station wagons parked in driveways. It looked like the most ordinary childhood imaginable. But only a few miles away, something extremely unusual was beginning to unfold. A strange, psychedelic current was beginning to pulse through California. A sound that would soon explode into a cultural revolution, tearing the country away from the buttoned-up innocence of the 50s and into the wild and electric energy of the 60s. Some people say this movement was born out of thin air. Others say it was manufactured. It depends on who you ask. While David was sitting in the back seat of his parents' car, looking out at the endless rows of palm trees, something new was creeping onto every radio station. Music that didn't sound like anything before it. Strange harmonies, strange voices, strange lyrics. Something was waking up in Los Angeles. Something powerful enough to change the culture of the entire country. And it all seemed to be coming from one tiny secluded enclave tucked high in the hills, Laurel Canyon. Laurel Canyon was not New York. It was not Nashville. It was not a place the music industry cared about. Heck, it only had one store and was home to only a few hundred people at the time. It had no major studios, no established venues, no reason for a wave of future legends to suddenly appear there. Yet in the early months of 1965, they did. Musicians who would become household names arrived almost overnight. Some had barely picked up their instruments. Some had never written a song. Some had never performed live. Yet they hit the scene as fully formed stars. And for reasons nobody could explain, they all moved into the exact same tiny area. Not miles apart, not spread across Los Angeles. But within walking distance of one another lived Jim Morrison, Frank Zappa, David Crosby, and Stephen Stills. Individuals who were then virtually unknown, but would soon rise to superstardom in unison. We're talking about the Mamas and the Papas, Jack Nicholson, Dennis Hopper, Peter Fonda, actors, writers, poets, an entire generation of cultural influencers, all mysteriously drawn to one isolated spot that was not known for music at all. This was the part of the story that fascinated McGawan, because as a child, he grew up watching this strange transformation unfold around him. This was not happening in Tokyo or London, it was happening in his city. He watched the clean-cut world of his early childhood disappear. He watched the long hair, the neon colors, the drug culture, and the political chaos rise from the very same place these musicians and celebrities called home. Laurel Canyon was turning into the epicenter of an emerging counterculture. Everything appeared normal at first, and it would be over 20 years before David would begin his research. But when he did, he would find the entire thing felt strangely synchronized. Too sudden, too coordinated, too perfect. Everything about their rise felt effortless. Everything about their location felt deliberate. This sudden convergence is where McGawan would later draw the first lines of his investigation, because the deeper he looked, the stranger the pattern became. These people were not random dreamers chasing fame. Many of them were the children of military officers, intelligence officials, or defense contractors. And the quiet hills they moved into were not as peaceful as they seemed. All his life, David McGawan had no idea he was growing up next to something unnatural, something that would one day become the centerpiece of his most controversial work, something that might not have been a cultural revolution at all, but something designed to look like one. A movement that felt organic on the outside, a movement built on art, love, and self-expression, but a movement that may have been engineered from above, perhaps to relieve the pressure building around a turbulent moment in American history when our president had just been killed, civil rights protests were gaining momentum, and the Vietnam War was in the process of drafting over 2 million young Americans into military service of which they had no choice. Though strangely enough, none of these young artists mentioned here were ever called to serve, even though they were mostly all eligible. But in 1965, little David couldn't know any of this. For him, it was just a strange new world forming 20 miles from home. A world of loud guitars, psychedelic imagery, strange adults talking about peace and revolution. It was history happening in real time, and it was only the beginning. By early 1965, something unusual was happening in Laurel Canyon. What had been a quiet hillside neighborhood suddenly filled with people who would become the faces of the psychedelic revolution. The way they arrived made it even stranger. They seemed to come practically all at once, many from out of state and with no previous connection to Los Angeles. Within a remarkably short span of time, the canyon was crowded with new bands, new writers, and new performers, all rising together. Nearly all of them arrived within the same year. That alone is suspicious. But the backgrounds of these soon-to-be icons made the story even stranger. A remarkable number came directly from families tied to the United States military, intelligence networks, and the defense industry. One of the clearest examples is Jim Morrison of The Doors, who showed up in Los Angeles with no musical background, yet became one of the most influential singers in American history. His father was Admiral George Stephen Morrison, the naval officer at the center of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which has since been uncovered to have never even happened, but nevertheless pushed the United States into the Vietnam War, destroying countless lives in the process. In the same band, Ray Manzarek had served as an intelligence analyst for the Army Security Agency. Robbie Krieger, their guitarist, came from a family tied to the military-industrial sector through his father, Stuart Krieger. Morrison's longtime partner, Pamela Corson, was the daughter of Columbus Corson, a highly decorated Navy bombardier and commander in the Naval Reserve. This pattern continued across the canyon. Frank Zappa of the Mothers of Invention grew up near chemical warfare research facilities where his father worked. Despite being clean-cut in suit and tie just months prior, Zappa somehow became a central figure in an anti-establishment musical scene. His wife Gail's father was a high-ranking nuclear weapons research physicist. David Crosby of Crosby, Stills and Nash came from an elite family with deep Hollywood and government connections through his father, Floyd Crosby, an Academy Award-winning cinematographer. His bandmate, Stephen Stills, spent much of his youth on and around U.S. military installations in Central America, living among American advisors during active conflicts. Individually, each of these stories might sound like coincidence: a musician with a military father, another musician who grew up on a base, another whose family worked in the defense industry. But when the list keeps growing, the coincidences begin to look different. Because these were not scattered musicians across the country. They were neighbors, living within the same few winding roads in Laurel Canyon. Bernie Ledden of the Eagles was the son of Dr. Bernard Ledden Sr., an aerospace physicist involved in missile guidance systems. And Joe Walsh grew up as a Gold Star son. The Mamas and the Papas member, John Phillips, was the son of a Marine and attended the U.S. Naval Academy. And both he and Mama Cass attended the same high school as Jim Morrison, George Washington High, in the shadow of the Pentagon, just minutes from the heart of Washington, D.C. Jackson Browne was born on a U.S. military base in Germany, while his father worked for the OSS, the intelligence agency that would become the CIA. Graham Parsons of the Byrds came from an elite Southern family with strong political and military ties. Even the pop-oriented groups followed the same pattern. Michael Nesmith of the Monkees served in the Air Force, and his mother's liquid paper empire tied her into high-level corporate and defense circles. His bandmate Peter Tork spent part of his childhood on a military base in Berlin, where his father was stationed as a first lieutenant during the Cold War. Joni Mitchell's father also had a military career, and she spent much of her life growing up on bases around the globe. The list goes on. And while the public believed these musicians were writing and recording the songs themselves, in reality, the real sound of the 1960s was created by an elite group of studio players known as the Wrecking Crew. They performed on countless albums credited to the newly arrived Canyon musicians, creating a polished musical foundation for artists who often had little experience. But the pattern did not stop with the music. A parallel wave of actors moved into the Canyon at the same time, and many of them had backgrounds just as intertwined with military and intelligence circles. Jack Nicholson served in the California Air National Guard during the Berlin crisis. Peter Fonda was the son of famous actor Henry Fonda, who also happened to be a decorated naval intelligence officer and Bronze Star recipient. Dennis Hopper, known for playing counterculture rebels, was the son of J. Millard Hopper, an operative in the wartime OSS. Between the three of them, they would go on to produce and star in films like Easy Rider, The Trip, Head, and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. These movies created the first mainstream visual definition of what the counterculture looked like. Actors shaped the imagery. Musicians shaped the sound. And almost all of them came from the same neighborhood, with backgrounds that connected them to the very institutions the counterculture claimed to resist. Laurel Canyon was supposed to be an organically grown community of artists. Instead, it looked more like a gathering place for the sons and daughters of powerful families, state officials, and military personnel. And that was only the beginning of the mystery. As Laurel Canyon filled with musicians, actors, and soon-to-be cultural icons, the neighborhood gained a reputation as a creative refuge. To the public, it looked like a quiet hillside community where artists gathered to write music, share ideas, and experiment with the sounds that would soon define a generation. But while the musicians and artists were developing their crafts in the homes scattered along the canyon roads, something else existed just out of frame. High above Laurel Canyon sat a facility that very few people knew was there. And the work happening inside was already having profound, never-before-seen effects in shaping American identity, culture, and how we were presented to the world. Hidden behind locked gates, barbed wire, and layers of security stood Lookout Mountain Air Force Station, a massive Cold War-era facility that most residents did not know existed. It was not a simple military building. It was a full-scale production studio with sound stages, editors, animators, chemists, and technicians. It produced propaganda films, nuclear test footage, classified research reels, and psychological operations material created for the intelligence community. At its peak, Lookout Mountain was rumored to be producing more film than many major Hollywood studios combined. Residents of the canyon often reported strange activity near the gates of Lookout Mountain, including armed guards, electrified fences, and security patrols. Floodlights left on all night, industrial traffic from the laboratory was clogging up the streets, and secretive shipments moving in and out of the base. Locals described it as a mysterious, windowless concrete bunker sitting atop their peaceful, rustic neighborhood. Little did they know of the important work being done inside. This was the military's top-secret Hollywood movie studio, and the place was massive. so big that it needed 2 underground parking garages, its own helipad, movie theater, and even its own fallout shelter. Low estimates say Lookout Mountain would release over 6,500 films in its 22 years in operation, though the facility's exact catalog of productions remains classified. Even today, large portions of its output are locked away in government archives. We do know that many propaganda films were shot there, and that such stars as Marilyn Monroe, Jimmy Stewart, Ronald Reagan, and even Walt Disney lent their talents to these top-secret endeavors. For years, speculation has surrounded its role in producing staged footage for major Cold War operations. Some even claimed that the Apollo moon landing footage was filmed there, a rumor that has never been confirmed or disproven. Whether true or not, the secrecy is what gives the claim its power. What made this even stranger was the contrast between the two worlds. On the hillsides below, young artists were preaching peace, freedom, love, and rebellion. Directly above them sat one of the most advanced psychological operations film studios the United States had ever built. The two environments had no obvious reason to exist side by side, yet they did, and they grew in influence at the exact same moment. This unusual mix of secrecy and spectacle set the stage for the counterculture revolution that would soon sweep across the United States. The canyon looked like a playground for musicians, but something deeper was humming beneath the surface. Something few people ever questioned. Something that remained invisible at the time, yet is impossible to ignore when the pieces are viewed together today. This was the shadow that hung over Laurel Canyon. A cultural awakening unfolding beneath one of the most secretive government film facilities in America. And whether coincidence or design, that combination shaped the world that followed. This was the environment that would birth the psychedelic era, and the deeper the story goes, the stranger the landscape becomes. In those same early months of 1965, when musicians were suddenly appearing in Laurel Canyon and forming the genesis of all things hippie, another curious character returned to the city.
Another with deep family and personal ties to the U.S. government and military.
Owsley Stanley, the soon-to-be King of Acid. He was making his very first batch of high-purity LSD, and he did not make it in San Francisco. His first lab was set up in Los Angeles, only a short drive from Laurel Canyon. Before the Haight-Ashbury explosion, before the Summer of Love, before San Francisco became the global symbol of psychedelic culture. The epicenter of both the music and the chemistry was Los Angeles. And then something curious happened. Almost immediately after Owsley perfected his product, the gravitational pull of the counterculture shifted north. The energy, the attention, and the cultural momentum moved straight towards San Francisco as if following an invisible signal. The migration was not random. It was guided by the very people living inside Laurel Canyon. The music was born in LA. The message was written in the canyon. The chemical spark ignited in Los Angeles. And somehow, all of it converged in San Francisco, exactly when the movement needed a new center. This synchronized shift sits at the heart of the Laurel Canyon mystery. It raises a deeper question about whether these events unfolded naturally or whether the cultural current of the 60s was being guided with remarkable precision. The 1967 Monterey International Pop Festival was the moment everything changed. It was not just a concert. It was not simply a gathering of musicians. Monterey was a shockwave. A bright explosion that tore across the American cultural landscape and announced that something new had arrived. To millions watching from afar, Monterey looked like a spontaneous celebration of youth, freedom, music, and creativity. It appeared as though an entire generation had suddenly found its voice. But behind the scenes, the festival was carefully organized by many of the same figures already living inside the Laurel Canyon circle. At the center of the event was John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas. Phillips helped design the festival from the ground up. He selected performers, shaped the tone of the event, and even wrote a song specifically to promote it. That song was San Francisco, recorded by Scott McKenzie. It became an anthem almost overnight. Across the country, young people heard the invitation. If you're going to San Francisco, be sure to wear flowers in your hair. The lyrics felt less like a song and more like directions, and thousands followed them. Cars filled with the youth of America began heading west. Hitchhikers appeared along every major road. Teenagers packed backpacks and left home, chasing the promise of a new world forming on the California coast. When the festival finally began in June of 1967, the lineup looked almost unreal. Janis Joplin stepped onto the stage, Jimi Hendrix followed, The Who, Otis Redding, Ravi Shankar, and that's just to name a few. The Mamas and the Papas, Jefferson Airplane, Simon and Garfunkel, the Byrds, Eric Burdon and the Animals, Buffalo Springfield, Canned Heat, Quicksilver Messenger Service, the Steve Miller Band, and of course the Grateful Dead, were all in attendance. Within a single weekend, nearly every artist who had come to define the sound of the late 1960s stood on the same stage. It was an impossible gathering of talent. Everything that the era would come to represent was on display. And the audience was not just the crowd standing in front of the stage. Filmmaker D.A. Pennebaker captured the entire festival with high-end equipment rarely seen at live music events. The finished film was distributed to theaters across the country, where millions of people witnessed the color, the music, the clothing, the energy, and the strange new culture that seemed to be forming. The Monterey documentary did not just showcase a movement. It brought it to the silver screen and added surround sound. The clothing, the language, the music, the lifestyle. For many Americans, it was their first glimpse into a world that looked completely different from the one they knew. Among the musicians, Owsley was also in attendance, and at the event he unveiled his newest batch of LSD, known as Monterey Purple. According to multiple accounts, the distribution of the drug, some 14,000 doses, had been requested by Mama Cass Elliot of the Mamas and the Papas herself. For thousands of people attending the festival, the experience became more than a concert. It was truly life-changing. The music, the drugs, the crowd, the sudden feeling that something historic was happening. For those who were there, it felt like witnessing the birth of a new world. Monterey created the blueprint, the sound, the look, the mythology. Every major music festival that followed traces its lineage back to that weekend. Woodstock, Glastonbury, Bonnaroo, Coachella, EDC. They all echo Monterey. And for a brief moment, the future seemed wide open. More than anything else, Monterey created the dream of California. It transformed the West Coast into a cultural promised land. Young people packed their cars, stuck their thumbs out on highways, and flooded into Los Angeles and San Francisco by the thousands. Monterey didn't just capture the moment, it accelerated the movement. But was it all naturally conceived, or was it a packaged, polished, and perfectly timed cultural movement that would reshape America and kick off what would become forever known as the Summer of Love? But just as the movement reached its brightest point, a far darker figure was quietly entering the story. The glow of Monterey Pop still hung in the air. The West Coast felt alive with possibility. Music filled the streets. Psychedelic posters covered storefronts. Thousands of people were arriving every week chasing the promise of freedom and a new way of life. But only a short time after the festival ended, another, darker arrival would come. One that would eventually alter the course of history. In 1967, Charles Manson walked out of prison after serving 7 years. He had no home, no job, no plan for what came next. What he did have was a strange charisma and a small but growing group of young followers who called themselves the Family. Beginning shortly after his release, Manson began spending a significant amount of time in the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco. His parole officer required him to attend weekly meetings at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. At the same time, that exact clinic housed a CIA-funded research program run by Louis Jolyon West, a key psychiatrist involved in MK Ultra. West was there to study the effects of LSD on the hippie movement inside its natural environment. His research involved high doses of LSD and amphetamines, the same drugs Manson used to manipulate and control his followers. The overlap is hard to ignore. Manson was required to be there. His followers were treated there, and one of the most notorious MK Ultra researchers in American history was running experiments from inside the same building. If that wasn't strange enough, what comes next is truly shocking. Manson would drift into Los Angeles at the exact moment the counterculture was reaching its peak. Thousands of idealistic young people were flooding into California, looking for meaning, music, and belonging. Manson was looking for influence, and he would find it in the canyon. His entry into the music world happened almost by accident. One afternoon in 1968, Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys was out for a drive in Malibu when he picked up two hitchhikers. Their names were Patricia Krenwinkel and Ella Jo Bailey. Both were members of Charles Manson's growing group. Later, Wilson brought them back to his mansion, only about 15 miles from Laurel Canyon. What happened next seemed almost surreal. That same night, Charles Manson himself arrived at the house. Before long, he and his followers had effectively moved in. They slept there, they ate Wilson's food, they used his cars, and they played their music for him and his friends. Wilson was fascinated by Manson. In an interview, he would later say, "I recently met a guy who calls himself the Wizard. He has a whole family of people. He's a very talented guy, and he's written some great music. We're going to record him." For a moment, it seemed possible that Charles Manson might actually become part of the Los Angeles music industry. In August of 1968, he was taken into Gold Star Studios, one of the most famous recording studios in the city. The same studio used by Phil Spector, the same studio used by the Beach Boys. Dennis Wilson and his associate Greg Jacobson organized and financed the session. Manson arrived with several members of his family, including soon-to-be killers Bobby Beausoleil and Steve Clem Grogan. Over the course of the day, they recorded multiple songs, including Cease to Exist, Sick City, and Mechanical Man. And the tunes honestly aren't half bad. Cease to Exist would later be rewritten and released by the Beach Boys under a different title. For a time, Manson circulated through the same parties and houses that many musicians frequented. He appeared at gatherings hosted by Mama Cass. He spent time at the Log Cabin, the famous Laurel Canyon party house owned by Frank Zappa. At another location known as the Spiral Staircase in Topanga Canyon, members of the family reportedly mingled with musicians, actors, and producers who were part of the expanding counterculture scene. For a time, Charles Manson existed right along with the celebrities and well-connected individuals in the canyon, each one inspiring the others and building the culture from the ground up. The final strange detail is how often Manson should have been locked up, but wasn't. In the 2 short years following his release, Manson was arrested repeatedly for offenses that should have immediately sent him back to federal prison. He violated travel restrictions on the very day he was released in 1967. He was arrested in Los Angeles for interfering with an officer trying to detain one of his followers. He was arrested for felony narcotics charges and grand theft auto in 1968. He was arrested for the statutory rape of a 14-year-old runaway in April 1969. He was arrested for DUI and driving without a valid license. Each time, the charges were reduced or dismissed. Each time, the parole system looked the other way. Each time, he remained free. Perhaps because his biggest act was yet to come. As 1969 approached, the wonder which was the summer of love began to flicker. What once felt like a dazzling ray of hope was now dimming under the weight of overcrowded streets, lost teenagers, rising addiction, and a growing sense that the movement had spiraled into something more unstable and unpredictable. The artistic utopia imagined in Laurel Canyon and broadcast to the world was dissolving, replaced by an atmosphere that felt fragile and uneasy. And drifting quietly through the same parties, houses, and social circles that had created the movement was the man whose actions would soon destroy it. Charles Manson's world had been growing darker. His followers were becoming more loyal, more isolated, and more dependent on the drugs he used to break down their identities. Life in the family had shifted from communal idealism to something more volatile. Manson had gone from a strange newcomer in Los Angeles to a figure who inspired fear inside his own circle. And in the summer of 1969, that fear finally erupted into violence. On the night of August 8th, Manson sent a group of his followers deep into neighboring Benedict Canyon to a home on Cielo Drive. It was a quiet hillside neighborhood, the kind of place where musicians, actors, and industry figures often gathered. Inside the house that night were actress Sharon Tate, 8 months pregnant, along with several friends. Manson ordered his followers to enter the home and kill everyone inside. The murders were brutal, disorganized, and senseless. The next night, he sent another group to the Los Feliz neighborhood, where Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were killed in a similar frenzy. As details emerged, the media seized on every sensational angle. Photographs of the crime scene graffiti, words like pig written in blood, the faces of the young women who had once seemed harmless, and the increasingly unhinged interviews with Manson himself. What had been a dream of peace and love was suddenly replaced with a national sense of fear and suspicion. Parents no longer saw hippies as harmless wanderers and idealistic dreamers. They saw them as unpredictable, dangerous, and easily manipulated. The psychedelic era, built on ideals of unity and consciousness expansion, now looked to mainstream America like the gateway to madness. The murders cast a long shadow across the entire movement. Festivals, communes, and psychedelic gatherings were suddenly viewed through a darker lens. Musicians were questioned about their friends and their drug use. The counterculture had been growing and was mostly still seen in a positive light. LSD had only recently become illegal, but the Manson murders collapsed it all in an instant. Overnight, the dream was gone. In the aftermath, a new enemy appeared in the national imagination. America no longer had open minds about these people who grew their hair out and talked about spreading peace and love. It now feared them and the drugs that seemed to fuel them. Politicians, law enforcement, and media figures pointed to the Manson murders as proof that psychedelic drugs represented a threat not just to social order, but to public safety itself. In the months that followed, a shift began. A new cultural target emerged, and the era of peace, love, and artistic awakening was replaced by something entirely different. In the days that followed, the Manson family murders became the catalyst for a national campaign that would transform American society and eventually send millions to jail. The shock of the murders hit the country like a cold wave. The peace and unity of the psychedelic movement evaporated almost overnight, replaced with suspicion and fear. What had begun as a cultural awakening was now portrayed as something unstable, dangerous, and corrupted from within. And immediately after the killings, the political response began to form. In 1969 and 1970, as California reeled from the bloody events that had occurred, the federal government began laying the groundwork for a nationwide crackdown. The timing was remarkable. Within a week of the murders, raids intensified against hippie communities. Arrests soared. Newspaper headlines shifted sharply from celebrating the colorful youth movement to warning about drugs, radicals, and counterculture threats. And then came Richard Nixon. While being openly anti-hippie his entire presidency, in 1971 he launched the war on drugs. The announcement landed on a country still traumatized from the Manson killings. Nixon's administration framed the counterculture as a national danger, linking drugs to violence, instability, and social decay. Suddenly, the world that had blossomed around the Summer of Love was treated like a public enemy. The closer you look at the timeline, the harder it becomes to ignore the pattern. The same musicians, producers, and actors who helped shape the counterculture also helped pull millions of young Americans into a lifestyle built around rejecting authority, embracing psychedelics, and exploring liberation from social norms. But as soon as those ideas took hold, the ground shifted beneath their feet. The laws changed. The public mood changed, and the people who had been encouraged to drop out and reinvent themselves were suddenly the ones being rounded up, monitored, and pushed into the criminal justice system. The contrast with the early civil rights movement made the shift even more striking. Only a few years earlier, many anti-war and civil rights supporters had marched beside Martin Luther King Jr. wearing suits, ties, and church clothes. Their message was focused, united, and grounded in discipline, morality, and organization. By 1970, the visual landscape of protest looked completely different. Long hair, tie-dye, bare feet, and drug use had become part of the identity. Some activists who had once marched arm in arm with King now followed touring bands, lived on rural communes, or dropped out of society altogether. A movement that had once shaken Washington with speeches like, "I have a dream," found its numbers reduced as more of its followers drifted toward the loose, psychedelic world that had blossomed so unexpectedly up around them. The shift was dramatic. A disciplined political movement had been transformed into a fragmented cultural one. Whether that transformation was guided, nudged, or simply allowed to happen, the effect was the same. What had been a united front for civil rights and anti-war activism became a scattered landscape of lifestyle experimentation. And just as the movement fractured, the country turned the full weight of the law against the people who had embraced the counterculture. Hairstyles, clothing, music, and drug use were framed not as signs of awakening, but as signs of criminality. Was this simply a coincidence? That the movement born in Laurel Canyon spread across the country just before the government began criminalizing the lifestyle that surrounded it? Perhaps it was nothing more than history taking an unexpected turn. But for David McGawan, the pattern looked different. It looked like a generation being reshaped in real time, a cultural shift whose consequences would echo for untold decades. Almost as soon as the well-connected began arriving, another pattern emerged in Laurel Canyon. In a small neighborhood with only a few hundred residents, many of them wealthy, privileged, and famous, the death rate was astonishingly high, far higher than the population should have ever produced. The list of lives cut short reads like a tragic roll call of the very faces who defined the era. Jim Morrison died in Paris in 1971 under circumstances that never fully made sense. No autopsy,
Conflicting accounts, some say a heart attack, others an overdose, all declared without any evidence.
His partner, Pamela Corson, followed him 3 years later with a similar fate. Mama Cass died in 1974. Officially, heart failure. Unofficially, whispered rumors suggested something far more unusual. Jimi Hendrix had lived near the canyon as well, and in 1970 he died of highly suspicious causes. Some say murder was the real cause of death. Janis Joplin, who spent time in the canyon's social circles, died that same year. Her final moments unfolded in a motel only about a mile from the canyon's edge. Graham Parsons died of an overdose in Joshua Tree in 1973. His body was stolen by friends, taken into the desert, and set on fire in a bizarre attempt to supposedly honor his wishes. Alan Wilson of Canned Heat died in 1970 in Topanga Canyon. He was found dead in a sleeping bag behind a friend's house. And Bobby Fuller, whose band had climbed the charts only months earlier, was found dead in his car in 1966 near the canyon under strange circumstances that remain disputed to this day. In any other suburb, the loss of life would be shocking. In Laurel Canyon, it became a reflection of something deeper. A place that had seemed to glow with creativity and magic also seemed to be haunted by premature endings. Artists who shaped the culture died young. The people who became the voice of a generation were gone before their stories reached middle age. The list grew longer as the decade faded, each name adding to the sense that something about the canyon was devouring the people who passed through it. In a neighborhood painted as a haven for artists, the steady accumulation of tragedy cast a shadow that no one could ignore. Years passed. The 60s faded into memory. The musicians who had once lived in that small neighborhood scattered themselves around the world, vanished from public life altogether, or, most commonly, met an early and often grisly fate. But the strangeness of Laurel Canyon, the coincidences surrounding it, and the culture it created never completely disappeared. It simply waited for someone to start asking questions again. That someone was the same boy who had once listened to this new music while riding in his parents' car. David McGawan was no longer a child. The year was now 2008. David had 3 daughters, managed his own construction company, and spent a fair share of his spare time as an independent researcher. With a sharp eye for patterns that most people overlooked, he published numerous books and essays exploring subjects others wouldn't. He spent years studying government operations, covert programs, and the hidden structures behind American culture. And eventually, he circled back to the place that had shaped his earliest memories of the world around him. What began as curiosity quickly grew into something larger. The deeper he looked, the more the pieces refused to fit the official story. The sudden appearance of musicians in the canyon, their shared family backgrounds, the classified military facility overhead, the tragedies and crimes that surrounded the scene, the political polarization, mass incarcerations, and all-out chaos that had unfolded in LA and the country over the course of his life. None of it looked random anymore. The canyon began to look like a place where something powerful had been set into motion, something cultural, something psychological, something that reached far beyond the music itself. McGawan started documenting his findings, first in articles, then in long-form essays, and eventually in an entire book. He was not presenting a theory, he was assembling a record, a chronology of people, locations, and events that had never been placed side by side before. The closer he looked, the more the story of Laurel Canyon transformed from a celebrated artistic birthplace into a tightly woven network of connections that all led back to government power. This was a world the public was never meant to see, and McGawan was one of the few people willing to illuminate it. What he discovered would come to define the rest of his life. As McGawan continued digging through archives, interviews, biographies, and official records, the story that emerged was far more complex than he ever expected. Laurel Canyon was no longer an inspiring chapter in music history that bore his heroes. It was starting to look like the center of a deeply organized social engineering program that played out in public without anyone questioning it, shattering countless lives and sowing the seeds for a world that had now become seriously out of whack. McGawan began publishing his findings online. The response came quickly. Some readers were fascinated. Some were disturbed. Others were openly hostile. But everyone reacted. His work spread across forums, blogs, and early social media, and suddenly his research was being studied by people all over the world. The core idea was simple but explosive. The counterculture movement that reshaped America may not have grown naturally from young idealists and musicians. It may have been directed by the same institutions that the movement claimed to resist. People who were supposed to be symbols of rebellion were connected to the same power structures they urged the public to reject. As more details surfaced, the questions became harder to ignore. Why did so many of these musicians arrive in Los Angeles before they had any musical background? Why were they welcomed instantly into studios that normally rejected unknown artists? Why were so many of them living in the shadow of a classified film studio built to shape public perception? And why did so many tragedies cluster around the same people and the same streets? McGawan published his work with a sharp, humorous, and sarcastic tone, but behind the humor was a detailed trail of documented facts. The timeline, the names, and the connections were all available in public records. It only required someone to assemble them in a way that revealed the pattern. As his Laurel Canyon series grew more popular, McGawan noticed subtle signs that his work was being monitored. His website faced unusual disruptions. Emails went missing. Visitors reported strange browser warnings. He mentioned, quietly and without drama, that he felt aware of eyes watching the progress of his investigation. Whether this was paranoia, coincidence, or something more, no one could say. But the timing created tension around his work. Every new installment deepened the mystery and elevated the stakes. McGawan had wandered into a subject that blended entertainment, intelligence operations, psychological warfare, and cultural history. It was a dangerous intersection, and he was navigating it alone. At this point, the story had grown larger than the music. It had become a window into the machinery behind American culture itself, and McGawan, the once anonymous researcher, had become the only person shining light into one of its darkest corners. The next part of his journey would take a sudden and tragic turn. Just as McGawan's Laurel Canyon research reached its widest audience, everything changed. In the spring of 2015, just months after publishing his final book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, he became sick. At first it seemed minor, the kind of illness anyone might brush off as stress or exhaustion. But within weeks, it became clear something was seriously wrong. Doctors diagnosed him with a rapidly advancing form of cancer. It progressed at a speed that shocked both his family and his readers. McGawan continued writing for as long as he could. His updates became shorter, then sparse, and eventually stopped altogether. People who had followed his work for years noticed the timing. McGawan had spent decades studying the dark corners of history and government programs, but nothing he had written before drew as much attention as his Laurel Canyon work. Nothing else placed so many powerful historical figures, institutions, and intelligence connections under the same microscope. His illness arrived at the exact moment his research was breaking into mainstream awareness. Whether this was coincidence or something darker, no one could answer. McGawan himself never made accusations. He only noted the timing and the severity of the disease that struck him. As his condition worsened, readers attempted to archive his work, share it, and preserve it. There was a growing sense that the investigation had reached a turning point, and that the story he uncovered still had chapters left unwritten. When David McGawan passed away on November 22, 2015, he left behind a trail of unanswered questions and a community determined to continue the work he began. But McGawan also left behind something else. He offered an answer.
McGawan believed the purpose of the Laurel Canyon scene was to infiltrate, redirect, and ultimately splinter the civil rights and anti-war movements. Instead of a unified political movement focused on ending a war, the counterculture became associated with drugs, instability, and chaos. It shifted from organized resistance to a lifestyle that mainstream America could easily dismiss as irresponsible and unserious. What could have been a powerful political force was reframed as a social spectacle, tie-dye instead of strategy, acid tests instead of organization, chaos instead of cohesion. By infusing a generation with a psychedelic social identity, they became easier for the establishment to marginalize. The more extreme the imagery and behavior became, the easier it was to portray the entire movement as fringe, distracted, and self-defeating. This was McGawan's ultimate thesis. Not that the musicians were agents, but that the environment they were placed in, the forces surrounding them, and the machinery behind their sudden rise worked to steer the culture into something loud, colorful, and ultimately controllable. Why Laurel Canyon? Why those musicians? Why that moment in history? His answer was simple. Because the anti-war and civil rights movements were powerful, and the best way to weaken a movement is not to fight it. The best way is to guide it somewhere else. McGawan's death did not silence these ideas. It made them louder. McGawan did not live to see how far his work would travel. After his death, the information he'd uncovered would live on. Passed from hand to hand, shared from forum to forum, his site would continue to be a beacon of light to researchers all over the internet. Kept alive by his eldest daughter. New generations who had never owned a Doors record or were alive to see the Summer of Love began discovering his writing on glowing screens. The story of that one small neighborhood in Los Angeles refused to stay buried. For some readers, Laurel Canyon became proof of a massive covert operation. For others, it was nothing more than an interesting curiosity, a strange cluster of coincidences in a chaotic decade. But for many, McGawan's work did something more subtle. It changed the way they looked at culture itself. It raised a question that does not end with the 60s. Who builds the worlds we live inside? Who chooses the faces that speak for each generation? Who funds the scenes that suddenly appear, pre-built, with their own music, fashions, slogans, and heroes? In McGawan's view, Laurel Canyon was not a one-time anomaly. It was a prototype, a demonstration of how art, media, intelligence work, and psychological operations could overlap so smoothly that almost no one would recognize it while it was happening. A few streets in the hills became a test case for something much larger, the quiet shaping of the population and the writing of a playbook in a brand new game, the manipulation of reality itself.
Today, there are no draft notices being sent for Vietnam. The music is streamed, not pressed. The posters are replaced by timelines and feeds. But the basic machinery is still there. Narratives are still being crafted. Movements are still being packaged. Influencers have replaced rock stars, but the effect is the same. A small number of voices shape what millions of people think, feel, wear, and fear. And despite its often shocking content, none of it feels very real. If Laurel Canyon was a cultural laboratory, then the world we live in now might be the full-scale rollout. None of this proves that every song, every festival, or every artist was part of a hidden program. It does not prove that one office in one government building scripted the entire 60s. McGawan never claimed that. What he did claim was that when power has the ability to shape culture, it will. And it will do so quietly, patiently, and in ways that look, from the outside, like spontaneity. In the end, the story of Laurel Canyon is not just about one neighborhood, or one book, or one researcher. It is about the unbelievable stories presented that forever change our lives and where they come from. Who writes the official myths that somehow become nostalgic memories, and crafts the subliminal soundtracks that play in the background while something else entirely moves the world forward? Maybe Laurel Canyon was a miracle of creative chance. Maybe it was a carefully managed experiment. Maybe it was a little of both. The question is not whether you can explain every coincidence. The question is how many coincidences you are willing to accept. For David McGawan, there were simply too many. And now that you have seen the same pieces he did, you can decide for yourself. Was Laurel Canyon just another chapter in music history? Or was it something else? Something hidden? Something that changed the world while everyone was busy singing along? Thanks for tuning in for another episode of Secrets and Mysteries. I am so excited to see such a rush of new subscribers. Thank you all so much for your interest and support as we continue in our journey to try and gain a deeper understanding of our culture and our history. I have to give another huge shout out to the man whose research inspired this video, the great David McGawan. If you're interested in learning more about his extensive research, including more about the canyon that we were not able to cover here because it is so vast, please check out David's site at centerforaninformedamerica.com. If you would like to know more about how the odd ways LSD was funneled into the culture, I would recommend watching my last video on Owsley, which goes over his strange and suspicious life. Link below. I would also like to say these topics have been difficult to confront. I myself have always been a huge fan of the music and culture of the 60s, and doing this research has caused me to rethink my entire identity and life decisions leading up to this point, so that's always fun. Thanks everyone once again, and I hope to hear your thoughts in the comments. That was how I found out about David's work after all. One random comment made by a wise stranger. Until next time, peace.